Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and today we'll be talking to Dr. Jess P. Shatkin, the author of Born to be Wild, Why Teens Take Risks, and How We Can Help Keep Them Safe. As any parent of a tween, teen, or 20-something knows, adolescents take risks. In fact, those aged 12 to 26 are hardwired to take risks. But if you're a parent, how do you combat these natural impulses? Do you remind your teen that they're not invincible until you're blue in the face? Or do you yell and ground your teen in an attempt to keep them in line? We aim to answer these questions today by tapping into the research and expertise of the expert Dr. Shatkin. Before we get into the book itself, let me tell you about Dr. Shatkin. He's a nationally recognized child and adolescent psychiatrist and one of the country's foremost voices in child and adolescent mental health. Currently, he's serving as Vice Chair for Education at the Child Study Center and Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Pediatrics at New York University School of Medicine. Dr. Shatkin has been featured in top print, radio, TV, and internet outlets, including the New York Times, Good Morning America, Parade, New York Magazine, CBS Evening News, New York Daily News, The Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times. In addition, for the past 10 years, he's been the host of the radio show About Our Kids. It's a 2-hour call-in radio show broadcast live on Sirius XM's Dr. Radio. Dr. Shatkin lives in New York City with his wife and 2 teenage children, and we are delighted to welcome him to the show today. Welcome to Nonfiction for Life, Dr. Shatkin. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Janet. It's great to be with you.
Well, we're excited to have you help us unlock the code to adolescence. A lot of parents and teachers struggle with adolescents because they seem so wild. So I'm sure that you're going to help us understand them better and help us understand better what we can do to work with them. You're an academic and a clinician, and you've helped explode the myth that adolescents take risks because they think they're invincible. What is it they really believe?
So it's fascinating. For years, we've presumed, without really talking to adolescents, that they think they're invincible, and that the reason they take these risks, like jumping off of a bridge into moving water, or driving 100 miles an hour down the freeway, or having unprotected sex, or drinking 2 six-packs of beer on a Friday, then getting behind the wheel. We've had this idea that they would only do this if they thought that they were invincible and couldn't be hurt. And the facts are far from that. It turns out that once we started asking adolescents about this kind of behavior, why they do these things and what's going on in their heads, they told us quite the opposite, that in fact, they feel that they are hugely vulnerable to bad things happening. Everything from low probability events like earthquakes and hurricanes, which almost never happen, but they will overestimate the likelihood of, to things that are much more likely, like getting pregnant from unprotected intercourse or getting HIV. So they always overestimate. They overestimate the risk that they'll die this year. Almost 20% of 15 and 16-year-olds in the United States think they'll die in the next 12 months, but they have no reason to think that they will. That's many hundreds of times greater than the actual risk. So the reason this matters, Janet, is that much of our programming, whether it's DARE, drug abuse resistance education, or scared straight policies, or the way we teach drivers and sex ed in schools, or the zero tolerance policies in schools, all of these things are predicated on a core belief that adolescents think they're invincible, and therefore we have to impress upon them how likely it is that bad things can happen. But no matter how much we tell them, look, bad things can happen, it's not nearly as high a risk as they think it already is. And so that's a faulty approach. And by the way, adults are also optimistic, essentially, and think that, bad things won't necessarily, those who are optimistic, I should step back. Those who are optimistic are not nearly as optimistic as adults about bad things not happening to them. So the reality is that invincibility is not an explanation for why kids take risks.
Well, from the book, we learned that adolescents are literally genetically engineered to prioritize emotions over logic, which probably is why this plays into it, into the wildness that and the behaviors. What is it about peers that is so strong during those adolescent years?
Yeah, there's so much going on in the brains of young people for the first 25, 30 years of life. And there's a real big change happening around the time they hit double digits, 10, 11, 12, until they're around 25, 26, 27. And during this time, the brain is basically doing what you just described. It is prioritizing what adults think to be some pretty illogical behaviors, because the brain is designed at that point to let emotions sometimes take over the activity of the body, so that the emotional part of the brain develops early, before the cognitive control part of the brain. You might think of the cognitive control part of the brain as the frontal cortex, or the CEO, the chief executive officer, the part of the brain that helps us organize and plan and make good decisions and remember things and learn from things. That part of the brain develops progressively, steadily, but isn't really fully formed until late 20s. Whereas the emotional part of the brain that lets us feel anger, anxiety, envy, jealousy, joy, love, that's really built up and intact by the time we hit puberty. And in fact, it's getting fed by more neurochemicals during puberty than at any other time of life. So kids are very emotionally reactive, very open to new experiences, very open to thrill seeking, very turned on by the potential for pleasure. And so they will take risks. Now, why would the brain do that? The brain does that because, as you're indicating in your question, we are born to be wild. We are actually built so that during this time of life, when our bodies are their healthiest, which is during adolescence, when we have the greatest pain tolerance, which is during adolescence, when we have the greatest immune response, which is during adolescence, when we repair damaged tissue better than ever before and ever again, which is during adolescence. So we have this body which is really built for taking risk, and a mind which unleashes the emotions on the world at times so that we will take risks. And I believe that this is so our species will survive. I think in a very sort of pithy way, Mother Nature has decided that we will sacrifice thousands to save millions. In other words, we will let young people who are the best suited for the job have crazy sleep hours, have erratic behavior, run really fast, dodge lions on the savannah, and run to find the new water source, and run to find the new mate, and climb the highest trees to get the best nuts out of the tree. Whatever it is, take these risks that adults don't generally take so that they will be socially successful, a popular mate, a well-fed mate, build a good home, and be someone who passes on their genes.
I think it's so interesting that we're genetically engineered to repair ourselves from painful experiences so well during the adolescent years, and yet they're trying to avoid emotional pain with all this wild behavior.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening is that they're being led around by their emotions at times. And we can do a lot, of course, and a lot of what the book is about is what we can do differently, because we haven't been doing things as well as we could have. But there's no question that they are being built for, I think, risk during this time. And there's lots of things that conspire. You asked about peers, and I want to get to that. But many things, hormones, these hormones like testosterone and estrogen and oxytocin, these things are not just about feminizing us or masculinizing us or helping us bond. They're actually about prioritizing social interactions. And the way the brain itself is built and the time it takes for the connections between the frontal cortex and the emotional brain to be built, and the way dopamine works, which signals to us what's important for our survival and what we need to learn about and do. It does that through the potential for pleasure. If something tastes good, it must be important for our survival. If something feels good, it must be important for our survival. So those things are built into our brain. When you ask a 7-year-old if the idea of putting a penis in a vagina is a good idea, they'll look at you like you're crazy. But by the time you hit puberty, that activity is very, very appealing. Why? Because it feels good. We wouldn't do it if it didn't feel good historically. And that's now we know how to make babies. But we didn't know 300,000 years ago necessarily, or a million years ago, that was how we made babies. We did it because it felt good. So now we understand that a lot of these things have been built in, and the peer effects are paramount. The peer effects basically suggest that when we are around peers, we will behave differently. And now we've seen that. And we even see that the brain works differently in adolescents when they are around peers. Because again, it's really, really important if you're an adolescent in the evolution of our species historically. It's really important that you impress your peers as a desirable mate. If you're a desirable mate, you'll get a good mate, and then you'll pass on your genes and you'll build a good home. And so you want the mate who is the best put together, who is the one who's the best cook, the best cleaner, the best hunter, the best gatherer, and this gets, signified in all sorts of ways. But the neurochemicals, the hormones, the brain pain mechanism, which you alluded to a minute ago, all of these are built to try and make us an attractive mate to others.
You've hit on some key learnings. You've talked about emotional wiring, and you've talked about kind of just the basic animalistic nature of human beings, that we're born to mate and procreate. What is it? I mean, that's not really news to a lot of adults. So what is it about this book that's different from other books about the teen brain that is going to help the adults who are dealing with wild teenagers and adolescents?
Sure. So there's a couple of books out there, and there's some good books, and they came out around 2014-15, and they talk about the adolescent brain. And I do devote a chapter of this book to something that some parents may have read before, and that is this idea of the brain and the way it's structured, and the emotions develop early and the cognitive components develop later. And I think that for people who've been paying attention to the science of the brain over the last decade, that won't be new news. I think what is new news in terms of the research I present is the invincibility concept, which has been known for a few decades but hasn't really been talked about and published. Also, the role of dopamine, the role of various social hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and oxytocin, the role of peers I've fleshed out in a more thorough way. So now we're talking much more clearly about the brain's threat mechanism, the brain's pain mechanism, and that I haven't seen that published anywhere in a more popular book. And there it's worth saying a thing or two. We know that we respond to threat. There's sort of a negativity bias in the brain, because if you can go weeks without food, you can go days without water, but you really can't go more than a few moments with a tiger or a threatening situation staring you in the face. So our bodies have our brains have a lot of their mechanism tied to identifying threats. Even little children will identify, 3-year-olds will identify snakes before they identify flowers in a picture. We are just built to identify threats that can potentially harm us. And as a result, a lot of our body and brain responds when we see a threat. So we are built to remember those threatening things during adolescence, and our brain actually remembers threats better during adolescence than at any other time of life. We can forget threats we're exposed to as children. We can forget or put aside threats we're exposed to as adults. But the things that scare us during our adolescence are things that tend to stay with us our whole life. And that is, again, thought to be a life-preserving mechanism, because we must stay away from things that can kill us, or at least know how to negotiate them. And when it comes to the brain's pain mechanism itself, we now know that the brain's emotional pain system has piggybacked on top of the brain's physical pain system. So if I ask you, Janet, or anybody, what's the most painful experience you've ever had in your life, 99.9% of people don't say it's when I broke my arm or had a car accident or had a surgery. What they say is, oh, that breakup when I was 15, or oh my God, when I lost my job when I was 20, or when I didn't get into grad school as I thought I would when I was 22. That was so heartbreaking. I was never in more pain. And this makes sense now that we understand the brain better. It turns out that the brain doesn't try to make secondary and tertiary mechanisms. It tries to use what it already has to be conservative and efficient, so that when we feel emotional pain, our brain registers it as physical pain. Pain is pain, and it feels it the same way, just like warmth is warmth. When you feel warm feelings or affection for someone, the brain's warm sensors also go off, the physical sensors of warmth. So there's a lot of crossover in the brain, and this is so important for parents and teachers and policymakers to understand, because if we understand how young people experience the world and experience their emotions, we can do an awful lot to help them negotiate the traffic in their head.
You're talking a lot about pain, and I know that that's one of the key emotions that is woven through conversations among teens and so forth. And I'm thinking back to how you said DARE doesn't work and so forth, that if we push knowledge towards kids, that's not the answer. But there is some emotion packed into some of the consequences of smoking, for example, or showing them the Marlboro men who played the role as Marlboro men, and now they've died of emphysema, and showing pictures of them in their final stages. Is that not effective because it's not their personal pain that they're feeling?
So the Marlboro man's a great example. Young people because, again, they don't feel invincible, but at the same time, it's hard to imagine for a 15-year-old what it's going to feel like to have emphysema when you're 55. So it doesn't happen that that's a very easy way or effective way to get them to stop smoking. Because again, the threat just sounds like, yeah, okay, I know I'm going to die from smoking, or the people die from smoking, but that's not, that's so far off. They can't even imagine that. The more effective ads showing the smokers who have the stomas, they're breathing through a hole in their neck, or showing the smokers who are dying and they have no teeth and their hair is in terrible shape and their bodies look old long before they age that way. Those are more effective, it's true, than just telling people about the threats. We've had package warnings on cigarettes for years and years, and in the last 10 years, they've even gotten more severe. Now it says things like cigarette smoking causes addiction, cigarette smoking will kill you. I mean, it's very, very blatant on the packaging, but that doesn't really seem to stop people either. Some of the more realistic, this is what you look like if you smoke. I think another effective approach is to think about why kids smoke. Once they become addicted, they're addicted, and nicotine is terribly addicting. I mean, a third of kids who try cigarettes will become addicted to cigarettes because they'll keep using it. So we really need to keep them out of the hands of kids. We shouldn't have 18 be the legal limit. It should be 21 or up. We should not let it be sold within thousands of feet of parks and schools. We got to knock down the advertisements. I mean, that's a big part of it. But the way I work with kids around this, both college and high school kids and junior high kids, is to tell them that even though smoking seems cool, and I know it's got this cachet and it seems like it's a very cool thing to do and it makes you a rebel. In fact, it's a very conservative thing to do, because the companies that make tobacco are the same companies that are ultra conservative, that are very politically powerful. They are the man. When you're smoking, you're not screwing the man. You're not saying to the man, hey, man, I'm a free thinker. What you're doing is quite the opposite. You're buying into everything the man is trying to give you, and you are not sticking it to the man. The man is sticking it to you, and you are being taken advantage of. You're giving your money, and you're giving 20 or 30 years of your life and making the rest of your life even of lesser quality, because you've become addicted to this man's package. And so I try to appeal to adolescents' sense of justice, because adolescents are often very concerned, almost to a one, concerned with justice and the idea of inequity and unfairness and not being treated like an adult. And in fact, by smoking, they're being treated like a pawn, and they're letting themselves do that.
Do you find that that's effective with the teenagers you work with?
Yes, I do. I find that it's effective in the classes I teach and in the individual work that I do. I haven't done a study on that approach because I use lots of other things too. I talk about that. I talk about what's called social norms, which I can explain. I talk about the health effects. I talk about what happens down the road. But yeah, absolutely. I think that the drive and independence is toward emotion regulation and self-efficacy, knowing that they're capable, knowing that they can be confident and achieve what they set out to do. And they don't want to feel that they're reliant on anything. They want to feel independent. And so by painting it this way, I'm saying, look, you're allowing yourself to be very reliant on something and very non-independent. You're actually, it's like it's not even a parent who's covering you now. It's some big, huge impersonal corporation that's taking all the money that you are giving them and using it on some very, unsavory things.
Well, it sounds like from what we know through generations, there is not going to be a change among adolescents in how their brains develop, and their emotions play a huge role, and peers become critical. So let's turn to the adults in their lives, and maybe you can give us some tips on how we can approach adolescents so that they can be safer while they take these risks, because we're not going to stop them from taking them totally. So let's begin with parents. First of all, I just have a quick question. Are parents or peers more influential in a teen's life? Maybe you get this question.
I do, and I don't think that I can give you a hard and fast answer. The answer is twofold. One is that before our kids hit puberty, they spend almost all of their time around adults, and when they're with kids, they're most often supervised by adults. After puberty, our kids spend more time with young people their age than they do with adults, when they're on free time at least, and they spend less than 10% of their time with parents. So the reality is that whether one is more important qualitatively is hard to say, but they end up spending a lot more time with their peers, and therefore that influence is really very large. That's first. And secondly, remember that they really need to, there's a biological imperative to impress their friends. and to be seen as a qualified mate. So they are going to put a huge amount of emphasis and effort upon what their friends think. So, my almost 17-year-old son, who's the greatest guy, I love him to death. He's wonderful. And we have so much fun together. And most of the time, he'll tell me he has more fun with me than he does with his friends, but he'll want to go off with his friends preferentially if he has the choice. And he doesn't even know why half the time. And it's true. He's just like, I guess I just need to be with my friends. And he needs to be with them because that's what he's driven to do. So you're right. We're not going to change the biological imperative, but there's a lot that we as parents and teachers and society can do to help make things safer.
Let's go right into that. I think with the small amount of time that they give us during those years, what are some of the best places to start for parents? What should we do? How can we become really well equipped to help teenagers through this risky time?
So the first thing is, and this starts even before the kids are teenagers, is to learn basic behavioral parenting skills. This goes by the name of behavioral parenting or parent management training. There are lots of good books under that title, parent management training. The methods are very consistent from book to book. There's no one particular to recommend. But at the age of 2 or 3, as our kids really start to assert themselves and start to say no, there are some very basic methods of positive reinforcement, effective commands, selective ignoring, limit setting, consequences, reward programming, and scheduling your kids that are lifesavers when your kids are young, and or equally as effective when your kids are older in the teenage years. It's hard to assert these things when your kids are 15. That's the thing. If you haven't started using these skills by the time your kids are 8 or 9 or 10, it gets very hard to now push these in when the kids are 15 or 16. It's not that they won't be effective or helpful, but it's hard to start then because it's a very different style of parenting now you're getting them used to. And it's filled with love and support and affection and direct encouragement and limit setting. And that really matters. And kids do much better in that environment. They actually have better feelings about their parents. They have better feelings about school and their teachers. They have better feelings about themselves and their peers. And they grow up to be kids who are physically and emotionally healthier and happier, score better, have better jobs, less likely to get divorced, less obesity, etc. So these are really, I think, life-saving tools, parent management training, and we want all parents to understand these skills. I go through them in the book in a descriptive fashion and give some examples. There are lots of other good sources parents can go to for that. The second thing is being with your kids, and this is an issue that is harder to do when our kids are adolescents, and a lot of parents actually voluntarily stand back because their kids don't seem to want to be with them too much, or at least they don't have the same kind of engagement as they used to have, where it used to be pleasant, now it's difficult. And so parents are like, oh God, I can't wait to grow up. You'll get, wait till you have a kid, you'll see how it is. And there's all these admonishments and finger wagging. And what I encourage parents is, as they feel the urge to step back, what they want to do is step in, and not step in necessarily as, again, the finger wagger, but more as just to spend some time together, to do fun things, to engage with each other, to take some walks in the woods, to go to movies together, to cook dinner together, to take bike rides together, just to be around each other. And they will see from the way you behave, the way you role model, the way you engage, that you are someone who they can still talk to and they can still connect with. The risk in adolescence is that parents stop talking to their kids, and they stop talking to them about things that now the kids are really dealing with that really matter. Sex, drugs, driving, all these kinds of things that get them into trouble. And we know now from lots of studies in lots of countries all over the world that when parents talk to their kids about sex and drugs and friendships and all of that, the kids aren't more likely to use sex and drugs and hang out with the wrong group. They're just more likely to see their parent as a source of reliable and good information, and they're more likely to go to their parent for that when they have a question or trouble. In the absence of a parent speaking with their kid, the kids will go off and, they'll get online, they'll talk to their friends, they'll get all sorts of information and misinformation and won't know the difference.
It sounds like if we just spend time with our kids, we lean in instead of turn away, like it feels like they might be turning away from us, that we'll be better equipped to offer positive reinforcement and to know which issues and conversations to kind of selectively ignore. So time alone sounds like a really good place to start.
So that's important. And there's also some strategies that parents can use that are even more sort of cognitive. So yes, being with your kids, using parent management training skills and approaches, and then also recognizing that your kids, engage in risk for all sorts of reasons that they can't necessarily always control. So having some empathy for our kids and understanding this is how it is, and then being unafraid to set some limits where we need to. Having a curfew, having the car come in by a certain time, the kids go to bed at a certain time. These things feel difficult for parents to emphasize, but they're really important, and they still really do make a difference, and they're very useful for our kids to know that the parents are watching the store. My kids, my kids until they left high school had a curfew of midnight, and that's like, my friends are out until 3 o'clock. I'm like, oh well, your friends are out at 3 o'clock. That's too bad for them. You're going to be home by midnight, and if you're going to be home, if you want to bring a friend home at midnight and stay up till 2 watching TV, that's okay. But I'm, I don't want you staying out. There's just no good that comes from you running around New York City at 2 a.m. So, I think that there's some control that we need to assert. And we also need to talk to our kids a certain way so that we focus on not don't overdo it, because that allows them to sort of make a decision in the moment. The answer isn't don't overdo it. The answer is once is all it takes. It only takes one time to get hurt. The chances of getting pregnant from one-time unprotected sex, quite honestly, it's not that high. It's like 1 in 20. But they don't need to know the number. You can tell them if you want to. It's not going to change their mind about whether they do it or not, knowing the number. But what will change their mind is explaining to them that one time is all it takes. It only takes one time unprotected sex to have a baby, and that's the kind of thing that can change your whole life. Get pregnant. Are you going to have an abortion? Are you going to carry the baby to term? Are you going to go to the prom? Are you going to go to stay on the gymnastics team? What are you going to do? And having those kind of conversations, very realistic, like what happens next? And what happens next? And what happens next? These are the kind of conversations that we can have with our kids that really get them to face the facts of what the reality of their risky behavior can be. And kids are much more realistic after having those conversations.
Yeah, presenting scenarios shouldn't be that hard because they probably have real life ones right around them from friends who are making poor decisions. Let's talk about something that all parents seem to have to deal with these days. It's a really new landscape they're navigating. That's technology with teens. They have, teens are attached to their cell phones, video games, other screens, and what kind of approach do you suggest parents take?
So I think it's important that parents remember that they own these devices as a starting point, that no one under 18 can get a cell phone. And most of our kids who are 18 can't afford a cell phone, that their parents are providing it. It's through a family plan. And so what I say to my kids, and I encourage parents to say this, is I own this phone. We can call it your phone. It's my phone. I pay the bill, which in most cases is coming to about $1,000 a year to rent the phone and pay for the phone access and pay for the gigabytes and all of that. And this is a real privilege. You don't need this phone to survive. None of us needs to know exactly where everybody is every second of the day. Who has the time for that? And this idea that we've convinced ourselves that our kids must have a phone so they stay safe is just ridiculous. There's just no evidence or data that they're any safer than they were. And everyone around them has a phone anyway if they need to make an emergency call. So the reality is that this is my phone. I'm going to let you use it. You can call it your own. And I will remove your phone privileges for a short period of time if you don't handle this phone responsibly. And I say for a short period of time because we don't want to devastate our kids with consequences. We just want them to feel the sting of it. And if you take away the phone for a week, you've got nothing else to take away, or very few. With the car, the phone, what else are you going to take away? Electricity? I mean, it's not that easy for a teenager. There's lots of other things that they, that they get automatically as living in this world. And there's only a few things that parents have that they want. When your kid's 5, you can take away a million things because you've got control over everything. But in high school, you have fewer controls. So use those things and use the control sparingly. Always give them the opportunity to earn it back. Never engage in a punishment that lasts longer than a day, unless it's like, next Friday you can't go out or something. That's fine. But the idea of a long-lasting punishment is usually seen by kids as a lot of retribution and imbalanced, and they don't remember what they did wrong or think that what they did wrong was so bad. They think of their parents as harsh and unforgiving. So the idea is to take something away if you take it away for only a brief period, but to own that phone. That phone is yours. And then when our kids are on screens, particularly in middle school and the first couple of years of high school, all that should happen in a common space so that The computers should be desktops, or if they're laptops, it's all in the living room or in the study or somewhere where the door is open and the parents are always moving through. We need to be watching our kids. So imagine giving a 13-year-old an iPad or a phone or a laptop where they can take anywhere and they can access the world of the internet at any moment. They could be watching lots of pornography, lots of violence, lots of illegal behavior, all sorts of things you don't want them engaged with. And so we really have to monitor that. And there's just no way that 30 years ago any parent would have said yes to that, but now it's commonplace. I think we have to rethink what's really good for our kids. And this is where the effort of parenting comes in. And it's an unsavory job and no one really wants to do it. It's a lot of work and it's necessary.
And I think that harkens back to your previous comments about parents and setting limits. We cannot blur the line between friends and parent. We have to know that we're not their friends.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell this story about how years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, when my kids were middle school age, one of them said to my wife and me and the other, "We're all friends, right? We're the best friends. We're best friends." And I said, "Well, we're not really friends. What we are is your parent, and we love you more than any friend could love you, and we'll always love you and always want to do the best for you and be here for you. But we're not really friends." And this really bothered the kids to hear this. And my wife immediately said, no, we're friends. We're friends. My wife's not in my field. She's in entertainment. And she was like, no, of course we're friends. We're friends. And it took a number of years for me to explain this to my kids. I mean, they understood the words when I told it to them, but it took a while for them to get it. And they joke around now. And one of them will come home and my wife and I and the other one are home. They'll often say, "Hi, friends," and Dad. They kind of joke about it and they tease me. But the idea is that we're not friends, and we shouldn't mistake me. We can be very friendly, and they understand now. They understand very clearly. And I have to set limits all the time, and my wife in particular, since she spends more time with them than I do, because she's home more than I am, we need to set limits, and they get it. Yeah. And I think that they would say we're friends, but we're very friendly.
Hi, Dad. Our non-friend.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, parents have to work with schools. They were told, we're partners with the schools, and schools have a huge role that they play in the lives of adolescents. What policies are you promoting for healthier, safer youth at school?
Yeah, there's a lot we can do at schools. I mean, schools is where our kids work, and it's the place to give them all the good things that we can't always be doing the rest of the time. But we could incorporate this into curriculum. When I go to schools, and I go to schools all the time, and I ask them, what do you want for your kids by the time they graduate high school or, middle school? And the parents always say things like, I want him to be a good sharer. I want him to be a good citizen. I want him to be responsible. I want him to do what he says he's going to do. They don't say, I want him to be great at interpreting Shakespeare or doing geometry. They really want our kids to learn citizenship skills, but we spend almost no time teaching that stuff directly. Partly because we haven't perhaps known how, but we do know how now. And so how do we do that? We teach our kids, we have to incorporate more social and emotional education. We have to teach them about their brains. We have to teach them about sleep and nutrition and exercise. Those things really matter. We have to provide better school lunches. Most of the school lunches in our country are terrible for our kids, and we have an epidemic of obesity in our country. 30% of young kids, or 30% of kids under 18, are overweight or obese, between the 85th and up percentile for weight for age, where they should be. They're not sleeping enough. Our kids are sleeping 5, 6, 7 hours a day. We know so much about the negatives of not sleeping well. So we need to have later school start times. And later school start times have another huge advantage in that they will allow our kids to be in school later in the day. So they'll be more on their own biological rhythm, and they will be in school longer in the day. Instead of getting out at 2 or 3 o'clock and hanging out at the mall or being home alone with their buddies, smoking grass or having sex, they will actually be in school. We need to enhance extracurricular activities at school so we can keep them there longer. And all of this harkens back to evolution. Our adolescents have a delayed sleep phase. They are built, just like they're built to be a little wild, they're built to go to bed at 2, 3, 4 in the morning and wake up at 11 or 12. We don't have to go that far. But the CDC, Center for Disease Control, suggests that we shouldn't start high school before 8:30 in the morning, which is still very early, but only 20% of American schools start high school at 8:30 or after. We should be starting high school at 10 in the morning. We know that our kids, when they start better or later, they do better GPAs, they do better in their SATs, their IQ scores in testing come out higher. Our kids get into fewer automobile accidents. And then we capture them during the time of the day that their brain is really on and they're thinking. And this would make a big difference. We could teach, again, all these emotion regulation skills in school. We know that when we teach kids breathing and meditation, they actually get into fewer fights. They have fewer suspensions and expulsions. Their grades get better. So we know all we need to know, Janet, to help the schools have a better environment. We need to make it a priority.
You've given so many good practical tips. I hope that we can implement them. You've done research yourself on teenagers, and you have your own teenagers. And I'm wondering how your research has changed the way you talk to adolescents about risks.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely changed the way I talk. It's been wonderful being a child psychiatrist because I've had interest and been able to take advantage of the knowledge of my field as my kids have aged into each new age range. And when my kids were very young, I was very interested in parenting because I was learning to be a parent myself. And I found, thankfully, behavioral parent training, and I learned those skills when my kids were about 2, and I started to incorporate them into our home. And my kids are, all in all, pretty well behaved. My work then became very focused on that. I did a lot of work with parents in this area. And as my kids hit teenage years, I again felt kind of unprepared. I knew what to do about the big things. I knew how to diagnose depression, and I knew how to treat ADHD. But I didn't know about the kids, most of the kids who were sort of in the more typical spectrum, who don't have such severe troubles, but run into bumps in the road. And so I've been able to learn these things, and this book represents a lot of my learning. And I certainly am much more assertive about risk-taking. I ask a lot more about it with kids. I understand it better, and I have a lot more strategies in terms of how I work with them. But yes, in terms of tapping into the emotional connection, in terms of how to talk to them about risk, I've learned a great deal, and that's all in the book.
And so we should not be afraid to talk to our children about risk. We should actually hit that head on with them, I'm hearing from you.
Absolutely. And this is just akin to what we were afraid of 30 years ago. 30, 40 years ago, it was believed that if you ask kids about the depressive thoughts, or if you ask them, have you ever felt like killing yourself, that would lead them to want to kill themselves, or lead them to want to take a risk and to become more depressed. We know that that's not true. We know that when we ask our kids, have you ever felt like dying? Do you ever wish you weren't alive? Do you ever wish you could just give it all up and go away somewhere? Have you ever thought about killing yourself? When we ask these questions, our kids don't think we're crazy, and our kids don't all of a sudden become depressed and suicidal out of the blue. All they do is think, wow, someone here is really checking in with me. No, I'm fine. Or yeah, sometimes I do get those thoughts. What do I do with them? I'm not sure. And this allows a conversation. And even if you're not sure as a parent where to go from there, you've started a dialogue, and you can then start to talk about this and work this through. The same thing with risk. If you ask about smoking weed, or if you ask about drinking beer, or if you ask about, driving drunk, this doesn't mean that you're telling your kids to do it.
This is great information. It's a clarion call to parents and teachers and everyone who touches the lives of teenagers and adolescents to pay attention and stay involved. Thank you very much for talking to us today, Dr. Shatkin.
It's my pleasure, Janet. Thanks so much for having me, and I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Dr. Jess P. Shatkin, author of Born to be Wild, Why Teens Take Risks and How We Can Help Keep Them Safe. We hope you'll agree that this is one of those books that is insightful, inspiring, and uplifting. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and this has been another episode of the Nonfiction for Life podcast. Remember, at Nonfiction for Life, we believe there's something for everyone. We'll talk to you next time.